A man with a $10 billion fortune, seemingly solidly successful, sits alone in a luxury restaurant that he owns. Not to indulge in expensive food or bask in luxury, but to search for something that money cannot buy. Something rare in this world. Sincerity. Jackson sits at a table near the window, the yellow light casting shadows on his face, yet the light fails to illuminate the loneliness enveloping his mind. This world is too familiar to him, an empire he runs, where everything is measured in money and power. He could change the entire city with just one phone call. However, amidst the peaks of his career, Jackson feels like an outsider in his own kingdom. He knows that the meetings he attends daily are just formalities. Compliments are scripted. Persuasive words are part of a well-rehearsed act. He can't even remember the last time someone looked at him without ulterior motives, with no other purpose but to win his favor and achieve something in return. That is why Jackson decided to make a change. Once again, he transforms into Jim, an ordinary, humble man. He wears old clothes bought from a thrift store, a wrinkled jacket, and worn-out shoes, so no one recognizes him as Jackson, the owner of Blackwood Holdings. He wants to test whether anyone will treat him like a regular person in this world, or if everything is just about glittering appearances. The Gilded Stir restaurant, where he sits, is the pride of his empire. A place where every meal is not just a banquet, but an exhibition of luxury. A place where only the wealthy can visit. Jackson could easily buy everything the place offers, but he knows that's not what he's looking for. He needs to find the truth. He needs to find sincerity. That's why today he sits at this table alone, with no secretary or assistant. Just Jackson facing the curious glances and invitations from those around him. He has decided to challenge himself. His challenge is sincerity, testing the honesty of the staff here, the people who meet him daily through meetings or reports, filled only with numbers, and profit reports. But one thing he doesn't know yet is that this experiment will not only force him to face himself, but will also unveil dark secrets hidden behind the glamorous doors of this restaurant. Daria walks into the restaurant, her face gentle, yet bearing a fatigue that no one could easily notice. She's part of the serving team at Gilded Stir, a place frequented by people like Jackson. But Daria is not a girl who can be easily overlooked in a crowd. She's not like the others, the ones who always wear bright smiles, ready eyes, and perfectly groomed faces. Daria, on the other hand, carries an underlying fatigue in her eyes. At just over 20, Daria already bears many responsibilities. Since she was young, she had to do everything by herself. Her mother passed away when she was very young, leaving Daria to care for her younger brother, Kevin. Kevin was not like other kids. He had cystic fibrosis, a serious genetic illness, making their lives revolve around hospital trips, expensive prescriptions, and sleepless nights. Daria had to drop out of college to work and support her brother. The job at Gilded Stir was the best-paying job she could find, but it also came with its own set of challenges. She had to work tirelessly, face demanding customers, meet strict expectations from her manager, and in particular, deal with Martin Kessler, the cruel manager she couldn't avoid. But in this world of extravagant meals and golden lights, Daria always tried to keep a smile. She knew that if she didn't, people wouldn't see her as a real person. She had to show she was professional, even though inside, Daria was enduring a storm of worries with no way out. When she approached Jackson's table, Daria felt that his presence was something very different. He wasn't like the other guests at the restaurant. He didn't wear expensive clothes or flaunt his wealth. Instead, he wore simple clothes, looking like an ordinary man, not the owner of a financial empire. Jackson sat there alone, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if observing a world he didn't belong to. He ordered the cheapest beer on the menu, a decision that Daria couldn't help but find odd. Usually, guests here, especially influential ones, would choose the most expensive dishes. But he, a man with billions, chose something so simple. Daria realized that not everyone saw Jackson as an ordinary man. There was something about him, not his appearance, but the way he looked at everything, the way he refused to sink into the superficiality of this world. When she placed the drink on the table, his gaze didn't avoid hers. Instead, he looked directly into her eyes as if he truly saw her. This difference made Daria feel at ease. She didn't have to put on a performance in front of him, didn't have to try to be someone else. Daria didn't know if he noticed, but in that moment, She felt like she was being seen for who she truly was, not just for her job, but for herself. When she returned with his food, Daria could feel the tension in the air, as if there was an unspoken challenge between them. Jackson was a man who seemed hard to approach, but his sincerity came through in his words and actions. And in that moment, Daria knew that no matter who he was, she would treat him like any other customer, with respect and honesty. Daria continued with her work, but in her mind, a question began to form. Why would someone like him sit here in worn clothes among strangers, alone? The answer wasn't in the restaurant's records or on the menu. The answer lay in the man she had just served. Daria returned to Jackson's table, where he still sat silently, his eyes scanning the movements within the restaurant. She placed a plate of food on the table, the air thick with an unusual tension. Tonight, her job wasn't just to serve food or pour wine. There was something deep in Jackson's actions that made her think. As she began clearing the table, her hand trembled slightly as she placed a napkin near the plate he had just finished. It was a small act, but it carried a heavy feeling, as if she was sending a secret message that no one could understand. Daria thought he would just throw it away like everyone else, like the meaningless words no one notices. But when Jackson opened the napkin, his eyes seemed to shift. The hastily written words on the napkin stopped him. "They're watching you." This sentence was a shock to Jackson, making him feel cold. He never imagined a server would send him a message like this. But there was no doubt. This wasn't a joke. Daria felt her heartbeat race as she stood in a corner of the room, her eyes glancing at the other customers dining. Jackson wasn't someone easily fooled. She could sense the calculations in his every move, every glance. But he looked at her differently. There was no judgment, no measuring of her worth based on her clothes or her job. Daria blinked again and realized that what she had just done wasn't a mistake or oversight. She hadn't just handed him a napkin. She had handed him a key, a path for him to uncover the truth, a truth that not everyone was ready to face. Daria returned to the bar, where her colleagues were chatting and laughing. A part of her wanted to explain, to pour out all the anxieties gnawing at her soul, but she couldn't. There was only one person in this world that she knew she could trust at that moment, and that person was Jackson. Though she didn't know him well, through his words, his actions, she felt a deep empathy. He wasn't a man out to prove power. He wasn't here to measure success by money or reputation. Jackson didn't need to wear a fake mask to impress people. He was simply a man searching for something money couldn't buy. That was the truth. Daria knew what she had just done was very dangerous. Handing Jackson that napkin was an act that could easily be misunderstood, but it was also a bold move. There was no turning back, but she didn't regret it. She turned back and looked at Jackson from afar. He was still sitting there silently, as though the words in the napkin had begun to awaken something in him. Daria felt a powerful wave rise within her, a strange sense of freedom, even though she knew she was just a small piece in a much larger story. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that this act had changed everything, at least for her and for Jackson. She was no longer just a server in his eyes. She was someone who dared to stand up, speak the truth, even if the price was high. Everything seemed to slow down as Daria turned to walk away, the tension still clinging to her like a shadow. She had done it, handing Jackson a napkin with words that could not be denied, a silent warning about the danger that awaited. But would he understand the message? Would he act in the way she hoped? She didn't know, but the one thing she felt in that moment was the certainty that there was no turning back. The rest of the evening, Daria continued her work as if nothing had happened. However, in each step she took, in every glance exchanged with the customers, she felt as though she was being watched, as if everyone was looking at her from a different angle. She tried not to pay attention to it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something of herself had been lost in that single act. When Daria cleared the last of the dinner plates, Jackson's eyes were still on her. He watched her with a subtle attention, as though waiting for something else to follow. Daria felt herself drawn to him, not by his attention, but by the presence that was so different from anyone else in the restaurant. He wasn't judging her by material standards like everyone else. He didn't see her simply as a server, he saw her as a real person. As she walked past Jackson's table again, he didn't say anything, but his gaze was full of expectation. Daria felt that immediately. He wasn't just another customer, He knew that she had handed him something important, and he wasn't going to let that opportunity pass. The sense of fear rose within her. She couldn't help but think that she had pushed things too far. If she was wrong, everything could fall apart. She could lose her job, even her career. But the truth, what Jackson was searching for, was something Daria couldn't ignore. She understood that all too well. Just then, as she prepared to leave Jackson's table, he spoke up. "Could you sit down for a moment?" His voice wasn't hurried, wasn't pressuring, but gentle in a way that caught Daria off guard. She hesitated but then nodded. She sat down across from him, her palms sweating as she thought about the words she was about to say. Jackson didn't rush to ask about the napkin. He just looked at her with a patient gaze, as though waiting for her to speak her mind. "You're probably wondering why I did that," Daria began, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not because I wanted to cause trouble or because I don't respect the company, but I couldn't just sit by and watch everything around me fall apart without doing something." Jackson remained silent, just listening. "You don't know anything about me," Daria continued, "but I have a younger brother, Kevin. He's fighting a rare disease, and every day he faces pain that I can't help with. Everything I do here is just to try to get enough money to pay for his treatment. But there's someone who's pushing me, forcing me to do things I don't want to. He's making me help cover up his wrongdoings, threatening me and my family." Jackson sat still, but his gaze had completely changed. There was no longer the cold indifference of a wealthy man. Instead, there was empathy, understanding. He looked at Daria as though seeing someone who had been through too much pain but still stood strong. "He doesn't deserve this," Jackson said, his voice low and full of sorrow. "I understand what you're going through." Daria was stunned. She hadn't expected him to understand, not just about what she was doing, but about the sacrifice she was enduring. "So will you help me?" she asked, her voice choking with emotion. Jackson smiled lightly. "I'll help you, and I won't let Finch continue to have his way." Daria felt like a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore. Jackson was on her side, and that changed everything. That night, as the restaurant emptied and only the cleaning staff remained, Jackson and Daria snuck into the back hallway. She felt a chill run down her spine, knowing she was about to face the horrifying truth Finch had hidden. But with Jackson by her side, someone she never imagined would stand with someone like her, she felt an invisible strength. Wren, the woman Arthur had sent to assist Jackson, was already there, waiting near Finch's office entrance. She wore black, holding a bag of equipment, her eyes full of preparation and resolve. Although she didn't know Daria well, the empathy in her gaze reassured Daria. "We have 3 hours," Wren said in a calm, steady voice. "We go in. Don't raise suspicion. Once we're in Finch's office, I'll disable the security system. You just need to stay outside and keep watch." Daria nodded, still not fully grasping the weight of what was happening, but she was ready to face Finch and the evil he had hidden. The three of them moved into the building, walking briskly but not hurriedly. Jackson, in his work clothes, blended seamlessly with the atmosphere of the restaurant, looking like an ordinary server, unnoticed by anyone. Daria, in her uniform, tried to hide her nervousness, but her eyes kept darting to the photos of Finch's family hanging on the walls. Photos that, in Daria's mind, hid the dark secrets Finch had been trying to cover up. As they entered Finch's office, Wren quickly assessed the situation and began her work. Daria stood still, her hands gripping the briefcase tightly, her gaze constantly scanning the door as Wren worked with the equipment. Jackson stood beside her, his eyes never leaving her. In that moment, Daria didn't feel fear. She felt calm, resolute. Minutes later, Wren turned back to signal Daria. "We're done. We've got everything we need," she said as she carefully placed the documents into a bag. "Let's go." But before they could leave the office, Daria noticed something strange on Finch's desk. A small box, sealed tightly. For some reason, she felt like there was something hidden inside it, an important secret they needed to uncover. "What's that?" Jackson asked, noticing Daria's gaze. "I don't know, but something doesn't feel right," Daria replied, her eyes fixed on the box. Jackson nodded, saying nothing further. In that instant, Daria felt like the answers she was searching for were about to be revealed. Daria could hardly believe what she had just heard. Everything felt like a dream, a miracle she hadn't dared to hope for. Jackson, The man with billions of dollars, someone she had never imagined she'd even get close to, was now standing by her side. But everything wasn't over. She knew this was just the beginning of another fight, a fight to protect her family from Finch's greedy and malicious hands. Jackson didn't say anything further. He simply stood up. He lifted his head and looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "We'll take care of this tonight. Finch cannot continue to threaten you and your family." Daria felt a strange mix of emotions rush over her. It was a combination of doubt and trust. She couldn't help but think about what Finch might do if everything was exposed. He was a monster, manipulating the economy and wielding power, and Daria knew he wouldn't let her go easily. But if Jackson was truly determined, if he really wanted to help her, then there was nothing left to fear. That night, when the restaurant had emptied out and only the cleaning staff remained, Jackson and Daria snuck into the back hallway. She felt a chill run down her spine as she knew they were about to face the terrifying truth that Finch had been hiding. But Jackson's presence, someone she never imagined would stand beside her, gave her an invisible strength. Wren, the woman Arthur had sent to assist Jackson, was already waiting near Finch's office entrance. She wore black, holding a bag of equipment, her eyes sharp and determined. While Daria didn't know her well, the sympathy in Wren's gaze gave her a sense of reassurance. "We have 3 hours," Wren said in a calm, steady voice. "We go in. Don't raise suspicion. Once we're in Finch's office, I'll disable the security system. You just need to stand guard outside." Daria nodded, still trying to fully comprehend the weight of what was happening, but she was ready to face Finch and the evil he had kept hidden. The three of them moved quickly but carefully through the building. Jackson, dressed in work clothes, blended seamlessly with the restaurant's atmosphere, looking like a regular server, unnoticed by anyone. Daria, in her uniform, tried to hide her nervousness, but her eyes couldn't help but glance at the family photos of Finch displayed on the walls. Pictures that, in her mind, hid the dark secrets Finch had desperately been trying to cover up. When they entered Finch's office, Wren immediately began working, assessing the situation. Daria stood still, clutching the briefcase, her gaze constantly scanning the door as Wren dealt with the equipment. Jackson stood beside her, his eyes locked on her. In that moment, Daria wasn't afraid. She was calm, resolute. A few minutes later, Wren turned to signal Daria. "We've got everything we need," she said while carefully placing the documents into a bag. "Let's go." But before they could leave, Daria noticed something strange on Finch's desk. A small box, tightly sealed. Something about it seemed off, like it held an important secret they needed to uncover. "What's that?" Jackson asked, noticing Daria's focus. "I don't know, but something feels wrong," Daria replied, her eyes fixed on the box. Jackson nodded, not saying anything more. In that moment, Daria felt like the answers she was searching for were about to be revealed. The three of them quietly left Finch's office, but Daria couldn't shake the sense of unease. That box. She couldn't ignore it. It was a vague signal, something she felt needed to be deciphered. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but there was still a part of her that couldn't fully understand it. Wren glanced back at Daria, noticing the worry in her eyes. "We have enough evidence to take Finch down," Wren said, her voice steady. "But you, Daria, might need to think about what happens next. This is more than just dealing with a bad boss. We're starting a war." Daria stopped walking. "So Finch, he didn't just do this for money?" she asked, unable to hide the doubt in her voice. Jackson turned to look at her, his gaze firm. "No, Finch is a real monster. He's not just greedy, he wants to control everything, including your life and the lives of everyone around you." Daria gripped the briefcase tightly, feeling like everything was finally becoming clear. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about fairness, survival, and truth. She had been dragged into a nightmare, but now she was ready. More than ever, she could feel a surge of strength inside her. Wren led the way, walking through the dark hallways with the confidence of someone who had worked in the shadows for a long time. Jackson and Daria followed, saying nothing, but their eyes met. Each of them had an important role to play in this mission, and Daria knew that she couldn't afford to fail. As they neared the area where Finch and the other managers were gathered, Jackson stopped and turned to Daria. "This is the moment of truth," he said. "You can stay here and wait for the results, or you can stand up and do something that will change everything." Daria sighed, feeling the weight on her shoulders, but also a sense of relief. She looked at Jackson and Wren, then made up her mind. I'm going to face Finch. Once and for all, I'm going to tell him the truth. Wren nodded, her eyes full of respect. Good. It's time to expose everything, and you won't be doing it alone? They approached the management office, where Finch and a few others were standing. The lights in the room weren't too bright, and the sounds of conversation echoed in the space. Daria felt her steps slow, but her heart pounded stronger than ever before. As she entered the room, Daria was no longer the nervous girl with worn-out shoes and fears she couldn't express. She was a woman with a clear purpose. That purpose wasn't just to seek justice for herself, but to bring truth to everyone Finch had deceived. Finch saw her walk in, and his expression immediately changed. He wasn't the smug man he once was. A hint of anxiety appeared on his face. What are you doing here? Finch asked, trying to mask his confusion with anger. Daria stood tall, unshaken. I'm here to tell you something you don't want to hear. Everything you've done has its limits, and now it ends. The room fell silent. Finch blinked and his eyes started to flash with anger. You think you can threaten me? He stood up, his voice full of menace. You have no idea what you're talking about. Daria didn't move. I know, and you know exactly what you've been doing. You've played this game for too long. Now it's time to pay the price. Wren stepped forward, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Remember, we have all the evidence to bring down everything you've built, and it all ends today. Her voice was cold and unwavering. Finch glanced around, realizing his grip was slipping. The threats, the fear he used to control people no longer worked. Daria knew this battle wasn't over, but one thing was clear. She had won the fight for herself, and now that victory would change everything for everyone else. As Finch stepped back, Daria felt the weight of her responsibility lift. She knew, however, that this was only the beginning. The three of them stood in the management room, a heavy silence hanging in the air, filled with tension. Daria still felt anxious, but now she was in control of the situation. Finch had taken a step back, his eyes filled with fear. He knew that everything was no longer in his hands. You can't do anything to me, Finch tried to maintain his composure, though the unease in his voice was clear. He looked at Daria, then at Wren and Jackson. Finally, he turned away, his eyes filled with disappointment. You don't understand. Daria stepped forward, her voice resolute and full of determination. I don't need to understand anymore. What I need you to understand is that all your evil actions have consequences, and I won't stand by and let you hurt people anymore. Wren stood nearby, leaning on the table, her eyes fixed sharply on Finch. We have all the evidence. The names of the people you've harmed, the things you've done, all of it will be exposed. All your secrets won't stay hidden anymore. Finch glanced around, knowing the weight of the accusations closing in on him, but he still tried to hold on to his arrogant facade. All right, do what you must. I won't give up so easily. Daria didn't say anything more. She simply nodded. We don't need to defeat you. We'll do what's right. With a simple gesture, Daria reached out to Wren. She didn't need to say another word. Everything had already been decided. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for everyone who had been suppressed and silenced. She had let go of her fears, shed the societal labels imposed on people like her, and stood up against an unjust world. In that moment, Jackson placed a hand on Daria's shoulder, his gaze filled with admiration. He smiled gently, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of understanding. You did it, Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. Not everyone has the courage to do what you've done, but you did. Daria smiled softly, her gaze fixed ahead. I just did the right thing. Wren stepped forward again, her gaze never leaving Finch. We'll make sure you won't harm anyone else. Everything is going to change from now on. Finch said nothing more. He lowered his head slowly and stepped back, knowing that the fight was over for him. It was too late to start over. He had been defeated not by a powerful man or a large organization, but by those he had once seen as weak and invisible. When Finch left the room, Daria stood there, feeling like a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. But she knew this was only the beginning. A new world would unfold, where people like her wouldn't be suffocated in the darkness. She wasn't afraid anymore, because she had stood up and walked through all the invisible prisons she had once endured. Jackson looked at Daria, his eyes full of respect. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for doing what I couldn't." Daria smiled gently, like the final punctuation in her long journey. "We do this for the people around us, not for ourselves." Ren smiled too, with admiration. "Now let's continue, shall we?" The three of them walked out of the management office, and Daria felt a shift in her heart. She hadn't just won a small battle. She had conquered her fears and doubts, defeated loneliness, and endured all that she had to suffer. And most importantly, she had won against an unjust world. Jackson, Daria, and Ren knew the challenges ahead, but they also understood that every step forward would bring them closer to a better future, where profit wasn't everything and where people always came first. And so their journey continued. A journey not just to build an empire, but to create a world where integrity, loyalty, and justice were always at the forefront. That evening, everything seemed to quiet down. While Daria and Ren wrapped up the remaining tasks, Jackson still sat there, in the very room he had once regarded as a meaningless experiment. Now it had become a moment of great significance, as he had to face things he had never dared to confront before. Daria had stood up. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for millions of others who still didn't have the strength to speak up. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of relief. This battle was over, but not in the way she had imagined. It wasn't a victory achieved through violence. It was a victory of patience and courage. She looked at Jackson, the man who had once been nothing more than a symbol of wealth and power. But now he had become her ally, someone who had learned that not everything of value could be measured in money. Jackson stood up from his chair and looked at Daria, his eyes shining with respect and admiration. "Thank you. Thank you for everything," he said, his voice no longer carrying the coldness of a powerful man, but the softness of someone who had changed. Daria smiled gently, replying softly, "I didn't do this for you. I did it for people like me. And for you too, Jackson. You deserve to see the truth." In that tense atmosphere, Daria felt a palpable change in Jackson's soul. He was no longer the solitary, cold man surrounded by walls of wealth and power. He was beginning to understand that life was more than just numbers and profits. It was about the people who lived within it, the people we often forget, but who are the very foundation of everything. "You can see it all now, Jackson," Daria said, stepping lightly toward him. "But we still have a lot to do, not just the two of us. It's a journey we need to take together." Jackson nodded, his eyes filled with a determination Daria had never seen before. "I know, and I'm ready." Ren, who had been with them throughout the journey, no longer felt like an outsider. She was a part of their team, someone Jackson trusted. "We'll need more than just a strategy. We need concrete actions to instill this value into every corner of the company," she said, her eyes looking directly at Jackson and Daria. And from there, a new strategy began to take shape. A strategy not only focused on profit, but also on ethical values, real change in how the company operated, and making a positive impact on the community. Daria became the company's chief ethics officer, a brand new position. Not long after, she started creating a humanitarian fund for employees facing financial hardship, those who needed help with medical care, or who had special circumstances. This fund wasn't just for people like her, but expanded to help anyone in need within the company. Both Jackson and Daria knew that this was just the beginning. They would face many more challenges ahead, but they also knew that with determination and the support of everyone in the company, nothing was impossible. During breaks, when the company was running like a well-oiled machine, Jackson and Daria sat together, discussing the upcoming changes. "Where do we start?" Daria asked, her eyes full of resolve. "We start with ourselves," Jackson replied. "We're not just rebuilding a company, but also redefining what justice means, what human value is in the eyes of everyone." Ren, who had stood by their side throughout the journey, was now not just an observer. She was an integral part of the team, someone Jackson trusted. "We will need more than just a strategy. We'll need concrete actions to bring this value into every corner of the company," she said, looking at Jackson and Daria. From then on, a new strategy was formed, one that wasn't just about profits, but also about ethical values and real change in how the company operated and positively impacted the community. Daria became the chief ethics officer of the company, a completely new role. Soon after, she set up a humanitarian fund for employees who were facing financial hardship, those who needed help with healthcare, or those in special circumstances. This fund wasn't just for people like her, but extended to help anyone who needed it within the company. Jackson and Daria both knew this was just the beginning. They would face many challenges ahead, but they also understood that with determination and the support of everyone in the company, nothing was impossible. When the first steps on this journey had been taken, Jackson felt an unprecedented feeling, a feeling of pride, because he wasn't just building an empire, he was building a better world where everyone had a chance and where every action held real value. That day, Jackson stood at the window of his office, the vast city of Chicago spread out before him. He no longer saw the walls separating him from the world, but rather a wide open road ahead. And he knew no matter how difficult that road might be, he would never go back to the man he once was. "We're going to change this world," Jackson whispered. And with Daria, Ren, and all those by his side, he knew that it wasn't just a faraway dream. It was the truth they would create, step by step. The next day, as the first light of dawn filtered through the city's glass windows, Jackson woke up with a different feeling. It was no longer the emptiness he used to feel when looking at financial statements or the cold numbers in reports. This morning, everything seemed new, as though a door had opened, allowing him to see the world in a different light. The company continued to run as usual, but in Jackson's mind, everything had changed. He was no longer just the head of a massive business empire. He was now the leader of an organization that had the power to change the lives of those without a voice, those he had once overlooked. And he knew that his responsibility had grown bigger than ever. Daria, after days of tension, was no longer the anxious, shy girl she used to be. She had emerged from the shadows of fear and found strength in her own integrity and courage. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for people like her, those who had faced challenges that no one else could see. During breaks, when the company operated smoothly like a well-oiled machine, Jackson and Daria sat down together to talk about the changes to come. "Where do we start?" Daria asked, her eyes filled with determination. "We start with ourselves," Jackson answered. "We won't just rebuild the company, we'll rebuild how people perceive justice, how they value humanity." Ren, who had been with them through the journey, was no longer an outsider looking in. She was part of the team, someone Jackson trusted. "We'll need more than just a strategy. We'll need concrete actions to instill these values in every corner of the company," she said, her eyes focused on Jackson and Daria. And so, a new strategy was born. A strategy not just focused on profit, but also on ethical values, real changes in the way the company operated, and its positive impact on the community. Daria became the company's chief ethics officer, a completely new position. Soon after, she began working on creating a charity fund for employees facing hardships, those in need of financial and healthcare assistance. This fund would not only help people like her, but also extend support to anyone struggling within the company. Both Jackson and Daria knew that this was just the beginning. They would face many challenges ahead, but they also understood that, with the determination and unity of everyone in the company, nothing was impossible. As the first steps of this new journey were taken, Jackson felt an unprecedented sense of pride. He wasn't just building an empire, he was building a better world, one where everyone had opportunities and every action truly added value. That day, Jackson stood looking out of his office window. The vast city of Chicago stretched out before him. He no longer saw the walls of separation but a wide open road ahead. And he knew, no matter how difficult that road might be, he would never return to his old self again. "We will change this world," Jackson whispered. And with Daria, Ren, and everyone else by his side, he knew that this wasn't some far-off dream. It was the reality they would create, step by step. As the last days of the year approached, Blackwood Holdings was no longer just a powerful empire. It had become a symbol of profound change in how large organizations operate. From a place that once only valued profit and power, it had transformed into an entity that nurtured fairness, integrity, and social responsibility. However, change never comes without a price. Daria, now the chief ethics officer, had gradually built a company culture where every employee felt respected, heard, and treated fairly. She wasn't just creating internal policies. She was overseeing and ensuring that the values the company was pursuing lived not only on paper, but in every action taken. But the further they went down this path, the bigger the challenges became. Industry competitors, those accustomed to the old ways of doing things, began to feel uncomfortable. The new regulations Daria and Jackson had implemented, which were beneficial to employees, were starting to reduce the company's short-term profits. Some shareholders began demanding Jackson return to the old strategy, the strategy that focused on immediate profit without regard for long-term fairness. One of the most difficult meetings Jackson faced was with the company's major shareholders, the ones who had built Blackwood Holdings from the ground up. They demanded that he work more efficiently to increase profits, even calling for him to change the policies Daria had implemented. "We can't keep going with these changes, Jackson. We need to return to the strategies that brought the company to its current success. Ethical values can be maintained, but they can't be our top priority," one of the major shareholders said, his voice full of pressure. Jackson sat in silence, looking at the people across from him with a steady gaze. He had gone through too many truths to go back to the old path. While he was aware of the price of change, he also understood that he couldn't compromise the company's fairness and integrity just for short-term profit. "We can't build a company based only on profit while ignoring people," Jackson responded, his voice firm and unwavering. "I've been in your shoes, thinking only of profit and reputation. But now I realize that what truly matters is what we leave behind for the next generation. This change can't just be a short-term strategy. That's why I've created a place where people can find fairness and respect," Jackson replied, his voice steady, without a hint of hesitation. The meeting ended in silence. The shareholders weren't happy, but no one spoke out against him. Jackson knew a real battle had begun, but he also understood that fairness and loyalty would always prevail over greed and selfishness. With Daria by his side, Jackson walked out of the meeting room, his mind full of thoughts. The next steps would not be easy, but he knew that if he didn't stand firm, if he didn't protect what he had built, it would all be meaningless. Daria stood beside him, her hand lightly placed on his arm, as a reminder that they weren't alone. Together, they would create a future where people always came first, and ethical values would never be sacrificed for profit. They knew these battles wouldn't end quickly, but they also understood that each right decision, each act of fairness, would lead them to a better future, where profit was not everything, and people would always be the most important factor. And so, their journey continued, a journey not just to build an empire, but to create a world where integrity, loyalty, and fairness were always put first.